Hey everyone, Fox with FoxeoGames, and this is Lords of the Fallen for the PC. Released in 2014, it was undeniably inspired by and riding on the success of the Souls series, in particular Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2. The game was endlessly compared to the series and featured numerous game mechanics that were almost lifted straight from Dark Souls. The question, of course, is this: is Lords of the Fallen worth playing as a game, and how does it compare to Dark Souls? As always, let's begin with the PC port. It's worth noting that the game initially released with a wide variety of problems, including performance issues so extreme that many people with high-end gaming systems found the game performed so poorly it was unplayable. Settings wouldn't save properly, certain settings didn't work at all, and the game would frequently crash or even hard lock your system beyond recovery, requiring you to physically reset your PC. I know of at least one other person who also found that the game messed up their BIOS settings when it hard locked their machine. I had to actually perform a BIOS update on my motherboard to get my system working properly again. I've never known a game to mess up my system like that. The good news is that most of these issues have been resolved. Performance is solid, and even with most settings at max, I'm getting 100 plus FPS for most of the game. I've turned shadows down one step as well as disabled vertical sync, post Chroma shift, and NVIDIA turbulence, a feature that absolutely tanks my frame rate. Options include controls for master volume as well as voice, effects, and music having separate controls. Graphics options include several items that can be set from low to very high, including an ambiguous general detail level setting, resolutions up to at least my max of 1920 by 1080, texture quality, geometry detail, shadow quality, full screen, windowed or borderless full screen, post-processing, volumetric lighting, post-chroma shift, anisotropic filtering up to 16 times, vertical sync on and off, and the proprietary NVIDIA turbulence on-off option, which I highly recommend you disable. There is no separate anti-aliasing setting, but the game very nicely features a functional borderless windowed mode, which is always a nice touch. As mentioned, with most settings maxed, excluding the ones I mentioned above, my FPS remains above 100 for most of the game, occasionally dropping into the 90s or even 80s. Key binding is available, and you can also bind your controller buttons as well, which fans of the Souls series may wish to do in order to make the game's controls mimic the game they are so used to. There are settings for auto lock-on as well as target switching. Overall, I'm very happy with the settings after all the patches, although I would have liked a separate anti-aliasing setting. It's clear that the Souls inspiration did not carry over into the art direction. Lords of the Fallen looks and feels more like Kingdoms of Amalur or Darksiders than Dark Souls. It's somewhat akin to a dark comic book style aesthetic. Many of the characters and enemies in the game, including the protagonist, are quite large and brutish. The player's armor choices, particularly heavier armor, are a bit gaudy and resembling that of some MMORPGs. Overall, the game has a consistent art style that tries to make everything look edgy, tough, and dangerous. It's a bit overdone, to be honest. As for the technical side of things, the lighting, shadows, and special effects look particularly good. The textures at max quality settings look good, and I cannot recall a single texture that stood out for looking bad or low resolution. Snow, fire, and smoke effects are awesome, but occasionally obscure your view. Whether this was intentionally or not, I don't know. Grass and foliage look good, but remain stationary and unmoving even in clearly windy areas. The mountains and sky textures in the background look great and add to the game's overall atmosphere. One minor issue is that because of the level of detail and objects in the game world that border on cluttered, it can be too easy to miss treasure chests or important levers and doors. Occasionally I found an enemy blended into the background too much and I didn't see them until it was too late. Character models are highly detailed and textured, although gestures and animations look awkward or even loop in obvious ways. The facial movements and voice sync can be quite off at times, and this problem is intensified by close-up shots during dialogue. As for sound and music, the game has a plethora of excellent sound effects, from the wind ripping by in outdoor areas to the incredibly visceral clunk of metal striking metal. Combat sound effects are all excellent, and you can't help but feel the intensity of battle as swords, axes, and hammers strike shields and bounce off with a resounding metallic noise. The sound of striking enemies is just as visceral and satisfying. Occasionally, certain sound effects seem to come through quieter than they ought to, and this is particularly obvious during cutscenes. The music in the game is nothing special, and just like the Souls series, much of the game lacks music entirely. You'll be mostly listening to the sounds of wind, crackling fire, and the heavy sounds of combat. I cannot recall a single song from the entire game that stood out to me in any way, neither positively nor negatively. The voice work in the game is a combination of decent and good. While none of it is outright bad, the writing didn't help these voice actors to bring life to their characters. And speaking of the writing, when it comes to story, Lords of the Fallen plain fails to deliver. There's just no way around saying it. The story is utterly bland and uninteresting. The world, enemies, and bosses are pretty generic and lack any interesting backstory whatsoever. None of the characters are particularly compelling either. The most interesting possibly being Yetka, although little is done with her, and her appeal is mostly through her sassy attitude. I think it's clear that we're meant to care about Harken, the singular protagonist of the game, but you won't care about him. Harken's character is trying too hard to be tough and direct, and ultimately just feels like a fairly empty vessel for the player to control. From the beginning to the very end of this story, I did not care about any of the characters in the game, and none of the bad guys stood out either, up to and including the final boss encounter. None of the events in the game seem particularly noteworthy or special, and expect to forget nearly everything that happens in this story as soon as you're finished with it. Also, the method of exposition for the story is not one I'm particularly fond of. You pick up scrolls throughout the game world, and as soon as you pick them up, a disembodied voice then begins to talk about something. If you happen to be engaged in combat or near something loud, it's quite possible to miss what's being said, but worry not, for what is being said is of little interest anyway. Needless to say, don't play Lords of the Fallen for the story or the characters. But how's the gameplay? As always, without gameplay you don't have a game, so what's it like in Lords of the Fallen? As I mentioned earlier, the game clearly borrows heavily from the Souls series. Even just watching the footage makes it hard to deny the similarities. This is a third-person action RPG with a stat-based leveling system and focus on choosing weapons and armor specific to your build. You can start by choosing one of 3 classes, the Warrior, the Cleric, and the Rogue, as well as one of 3 branches of magic. I'm not gonna lie to you, I found most of the magic pretty useless and rarely ever used it, so I can't comment a great deal on it. I also never felt it was worth specializing in magic, so I didn't put stat points towards that path. I played through the entire game as a warrior and played through part of the game as both cleric and rogue. The warrior and cleric feel pretty similar in many ways, although the cleric starts with a much heavier hammer than the warrior's sword. The rogue is the most unique of the 3, favoring a fast-paced combat style in stark contrast to the other 2 classes, which normally play with quite slow weapons compared to your average action game. Just like with the Souls series, you can lock onto a single target, placing your focus and direction on that enemy, and you have light and heavy attacks mapped to the shoulder buttons. Shields play a major role in the game, featuring small shields capable of parries, medium shields, and heavy shields. The game includes a nice running shield bash, which comes in handy quite often. Health potions can be restocked at checkpoints, and you can find more empty bottles to increase the maximum number of potions you can carry at once. The experience system borrows from Dark Souls but modifies the basic formula. You get experience from slaying enemies and also from accomplishing other in-game goals. As you gain more and more experience, you can build up your experience modifier, essentially yielding even more experience to you. However, this increases your risk because when you die, you drop all of your experience and must recover it without dying a second time, just like in the Souls series. Unlike Dark Souls, however, you can safely store your experience at the checkpoints and then use them whenever you'd like, but doing so resets your modifier and lowers the overall experience you gain. Oh, and there are no merchants in the game and thus no money system. Experience is only used for leveling up your stats. Combat in the game is primarily slower and more methodical than most other action games, requiring you to learn and adapt to your opponent's moves and timings. You have a variety of attacks and can avoid damage by either rolling or blocking with a shield. Many enemies will hit you with devastating combos or use nearly impenetrable shields, which makes spamming attacks a surefire way to die. Certain enemies throughout the game can be particularly challenging and do not respawn, making them effectively like a mini-boss. Bosses in the game are usually fairly large and intimidating. You enter the boss arena through a gate that seals behind you, and it's just the 2 of you. Well, sometimes they call additional adds, but you know what I mean. Bosses can hit particularly hard, and some even have abilities which function as instant kills if you get caught by them. A few bosses require knowing a special trick in order to defeat them or avoid certain death. Defeating a boss will generally unlock the next area of the game, making Lords of the Fallen a mostly linear experience with a bit of exploration thrown in for good measure. If you keep your eyes open and explore every nook and cranny, you'll find additional gear and treasure hidden away. Levels will loop back around and interweave through the use of levers, gates, and doors that only open from one side, a feature that will feel very familiar to fans of the Souls series. All in all, Lords of the Fallen is a slower-paced, more methodical action RPG that requires careful attention to blocking, dodging, and combat timing. So what's the verdict? Well, where do I start with all the ways that Lords of the Fallen goes wrong? We've covered the uninteresting story and characters already, so I won't tread that subject again. As for the graphics, I mainly had positive things to say about them, but I do want to point out that the game feels like it's trying too hard to look cool and edgy, and ultimately the complexity of design of all enemies makes the bosses sometimes look less domineering and terrifying than they should. I found a few regular enemies to look more menacing than some of the bosses. Also related to the graphics is the camera movement during combat. I can't stress enough just how disorienting and uncomfortable the extreme camera wobble can be. Rolling, blocking, attacking, and running all cause the third-person camera to bob and weave, even wobble like it's floating on top of the ocean. This feature is definitely overdone, and there absolutely needs to be an option to turn it off or at least to reduce it. Additionally, there's the occasional cinematic camera view for finishing moves on enemies, and it's frustrating to have camera control forcibly taken away from you to try to look cool. Every game with cinematic finishers needs to have an option to turn them off, and many in fact do. Lords of the Fallen does not. Unfortunately, these are some of the more minor complaints about the game. Lords of the Fallen's biggest problem is the combat. While it does feature a good deal of variety in the melee and magic, it's terribly imbalanced. I played as all 3 classes, and the game is obviously geared more for the warrior than the cleric, and it is outright biased against the rogue. Take my advice and do not play as a rogue. The rogue's primary advantage is supposed to be the fact that you can move and attack faster, building up combo attacks through sheer number of hits. In reality, the rogue is horribly gimped by the basic combat in the game. Let me explain. It's often difficult to stagger enemies, particularly with lighter weapons that the rogue uses. The rogue needs to strike enemies many times in a row to build up that combo damage in order to be effective. However, many enemies, particularly the larger ones including bosses, will block or attack you long before you can get enough hits to do any significant damage. That is to say, you will either be blocked by a massive shield on an enemy who pivot turns to match you exactly, preventing you from circling around behind, or you will be hit and staggered by the enemy before you land more than a couple hits. You can try to parry enemies with the smaller shields, but I found it unreliable. Don't play as a rogue. The cleric can be made to work just as the warrior can, but all classes suffer from the above mentioned enemy timings. The sad fact is that the developers utterly failed to balance the attack, block, and dodge timings of the enemies to that of the player. In many cases, by the time I recover from a dodge or block, the enemy has already returned to blocking or attacking again, giving me virtually no opportunity to strike back. This is especially noticeable with bosses who barely give you enough time to land one hit, maybe two at best. In many cases, I had to try to time and distance gauge my attack in such a way that I started my swing before the boss even finished his attack in order to get the hit in before the boss returned to blocking. More often than not, dodging or blocking the attack left me with absolutely zero opportunity to strike. The game features a projectile launching gauntlet, but I found it utterly incapable of dealing any significant damage whatsoever. Also, the magic that I used most often, which is designed to produce a clone to distract enemies, never seemed to work on bosses, making it useless when I needed it most. I wish this problem were limited to bosses, but it's not. Take this enemy for example. Defeating this beast is a painfully boring chore. The only solution I found was to back up, do a running shield bash, get one hit in, then back out again, rinse and repeat, over and over and over again. There might be another way to get hits in, but I couldn't find one. To make matters worse, many enemies and bosses will inevitably and unavoidably hit you under many circumstances. Even using one of the faster swinging weapons on my warrior, I found that after blocking or dodging an attack, I would strike the enemy once while they were rebounding, and then before I can recover from my attack, the enemy would hit me, sometimes more than once. I'm completely unable to raise my shield, dodge, or move out of the way since I'm still recovering from the attack animation. The heavier, slower weapons in the game leave you vulnerable for absurdly long periods of time, both during the attack windup and recovery. I found them virtually useless in most situations as they inevitably led to me taking loads of damage. Unlike the Souls series to which the game is so often compared, Lords of the Fallen is the kind of game where no matter how good you are, you're going to get hit and take a lot of damage. As some others have mentioned, the combat in this game is best described as a slow, clunky, sloppy version of what you'd get in a Souls game. The controls were mostly functional, but at times felt incredibly unresponsive. Rolling to dodge often resulted in getting hit and felt far less useful than it should have. Even at full energy bar with stats invested, I found many enemies and nearly all bosses would just eat through all of my blocking ability and do significant damage too. You're left feeling like there's no way to avoid getting hit. You get hit when you dodge, you get hit when you block, and you can't move fast enough to walk out of range of the attack. To add insult to injury, the lock-on was often unresponsive and wouldn't lock on even when my character was facing an enemy right in front of me. I had to wait for the wobbly camera to slowly shift back behind my character for the lock-on to respond properly. Now, I don't want to leave you thinking that Lords of the Fallen is a complete failure. There were times when I felt like I was getting the hang of it and things were working as intended, but for every moment of fun and functional gameplay, it felt like there was another moment of frustration and dysfunction. All in all, Lords of the Fallen ultimately left me feeling like playing it was an annoying and frustrating chore. The good aspects of the game simply don't outweigh the bad. Gameplay is king in video games, and the gameplay here is just so poorly balanced that it can't be overlooked. If you like the Souls series, this isn't the game for you. In fact, if you like good action RPGs, this isn't the game for you. I recommend you pass on this one entirely. But what did you guys think of Lords of the Fallen, and specifically, how does it compare to the Souls series? Leave your comments below, like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and check the video description for links to my Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, and all that other good stuff. I'm Fox with FoxeoGames, and I'll see you next time.